Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Lindsay Davis, and I am Visitor Engagement Coordinator here at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum in downtown St. Louis. I'll give like a minute or so if anyone else wants to pop on before I launch into the introduction, but we're very happy to have you here. Thank you for attending this morning's program entitled Canvas is the New Kashmir. While this program is virtual, I'd like to remind you that Soldiers Memorial is open Wednesdays through Sundays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. with several safety precautions in place. We would love to have you visit if you feel safe doing so. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Missouri Historical Society's members. If you're not a member, but you're interested in becoming one, I will place a link in the chat here shortly for you to check out. You can copy and paste that link into your browser. Now I need to quickly mention a few details about how today's program will run. This will be a roughly 30 to 40 minute program with 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you'd like to submit questions for the Q&A, you'll use the Q&A button in your toolbar on Zoom. Please know that we'll do our best, but we can't promise to get to every question. Today's presentation is being recorded, so if you would like to view it again or share it with others, it'll be posted on our Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel soon after the program ends. Now I'd like to introduce my fellow speaker, Lydia Prevish, who's Soldiers Memorial's Education Coordinator. So Lydia, you can go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So when you think military influence on fashion, images of cargo pants, bomber jackets, combat boots, and aviator sunglasses probably come to mind. And while these are great examples, in truth, the influence of military gear on civilian clothing goes far beyond. In a moment, Lindsay's going to talk about how military uniforms went from glamour to practicality due to changes in warfare and technology. And later, we're going to talk about how for fashion, the borrowing of military style has been motivated by marketing that made imitating soldiers desirable. Whether through romanticism, practicality, or aesthetics, military and work uniforms made for function were brought into the realm of fashion. We'll explore the inclusion of military influence from epaulets to Eisenhower jackets and beyond in this presentation.
All right, thanks Lydia for that intro. We're gonna go ahead now and take it back to the 19th century. So in this time period, military uniforms, especially those of officers, paid arguably more attention to fashion than they did function. So you go ahead and take a look at this illustration from an early encyclopedia and you'll see a little bit of what I mean. So note the bright colors, plumes coming out of helmets, and hats. Officers were men of means and men of status. They also often wore their uniforms outside of the military context. So at social events, places where they wanted to look powerful, they wanted to look heroic. And that all went into how the uniform ended up looking. Officers especially went and were in charge of buying their own uniforms. So they'd go to their favorite tailor, the place where they went to create the rest of their uniform, their civilian wardrobe. And those would be the people who would create their military wardrobe. So now we're going to take a little closer look at two of the most common embellishments that were seen in a lot of military uniforms of the time. Those being soutache and epaulets. Soutache was a thinly braided strand that went along military jackets. Here, it's wrapped into a clover shape along the arm of the jacket. It's held at the Smithsonian Institution, and it's going into that clover shape there. It could also be in any other part of the military jacket, often seen in straight lines across the chest or in swirling patterns throughout. Also along the shoulders and back of the uniform jacket as well. Epaulets were strips of fabric that were attached to the shoulders of the military uniform. They were often either braided, like this example we have here from our own Missouri Historical Society collections, or they were just strips of fabric that denoted the rank of the officer who was wearing that uniform outfit. So elements like these are the most long-lasting element of the fanciful 19th century military uniform. A lot of the other embellishments, things like those plumes or the bright colors on jackets, had to be done away with in the modern battlefield, as As technology advanced and there were no longer smoke-filled battlefields that dulled colors and hid soldiers, those bright colors and those ornamental parts of the uniform really made soldiers targets on the battlefield. It's really easy to spot the man with ostrich feathers sticking out of the top of his hat. It's a little harder to spot a soldier with duller colors that blend into the environment, kind of the first beginnings of military camouflage. So, however, this heroic and dashing image of the soldier that comes out of 19th century military uniforms really stuck around in civilian fashion and made its mark on civilian clothing. So I think the prime example of that, especially for the 1860s, the American Civil War, are the Zouaves. The Zouaves were an elite French unit that began in 1831 in French Algeria. They were initially made up of Algerian tribesmen who the French wanted to bring along and help impose their colonial regime. The Zouave uniform is incredibly unique, even for the fanciful European military dress. It takes a lot of inspiration from Islamic art and fashion, meaning things like, take a look at this illustration on the bottom here, the billowing pants, brightly colored jackets, usually with some really ornate embroidery along the sides of the jacket coat itself. And usually as well, the Zouave uniform was topped off with a fez or a turban or some other kind of wrap. The Zouaves captured the civilian imagination across the world, both out of their exotic dress and their military prowess. They became a very well-known unit of soldiers. So well known, in fact, that the British Army incorporated a Zouave unit of their own, pretty much copying down to the last detail the Zouaves of the French. And even during the American Civil War, Zouave units fought alongside the Union Blue and the Confederate Gray. They're soon done away with, however, especially in the Civil War, for the reasons I mentioned before. They're bright, they're colorful, they're very easy to spot. It became very easy for enemy fire to find a Zouave versus someone in a more plain uniform. However, as I mentioned, they did capture the civilian imagination. So, for example, in this top left image here, this is actually an advertisement for a St. Louis-based tobacco company where they use the Zouave as kind of a mascot for their company. And as well as really capturing the public imagination, the Zouave uniform became a staple of 1860s women's fashion, with a whole lot of Zouave jackets in women's fashion in the 1860s became the real craze. Usually they were more muted colors, more quote unquote feminine colors for women's Zouave jackets, such as the white here on the left from the museum at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. You can see there the soutache detailing as well, the intricate braiding that lines both sides of the jacket. However, I really am interested in this jacket over here to the right that's at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This jacket, worn in the 1860s, also really truly sticks to the Zouave fashion sense. It's not only the shape of the Zouave jacket, as the other two examples to the left are, but it really sticks closely to the Zouave style itself. Okay, moving past the Zouaves, other women during the American Civil War found ways to show their patriotism, their support for the troops on both sides, and their desire to boost morale of their soldiers through their fashion. This dress from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a great example. It really aligns closely to the image on the right, which is a Civil War musician's uniform with the striped detailing along the front of the jacket. And you can also see a little bit of the epaulette detail on the sides, that women's fashion was mirroring what their men were wearing off at war as a way to both feel close to the men on the front lines, but then also kind of dress in the way they were with a little bit feminine touches. As you can notice at the bottom of the jacket, there's little mother of pearl beads stringing along. So it's a way to make military a little bit more feminine, but still stick to the military style. This next dress, which is also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also takes a lot of influence from military fashion, especially what military members were wearing during the Civil War. The buttons down the front really mirror a Union soldier's coat. As well, you can see the epaulets on the side. They make use of military buttons as well, very similar to the style worn by Civil War soldiers. And then down the side of the dress, you can see there's a garland running on both sides, capped in a rosette, which is reminiscent of the style of decorations in military celebrations. What's also really interesting is that some women, especially Confederate sympathizing women who lived in Union-controlled areas, they couldn't proudly show that they supported the Confederacy. That get them in a lot of trouble. So there are some accounts of women talking about they would wear Confederate colors in their underclothes. So things that weren't easily seen from outside. No one walking down the street could tell you were a Confederate sympathizer, but they knew deep down that they were repping their colors. So that was very interesting. And this next slide here is just a little look at the inspiration for that last dress. You can see the buttons going down the front, how even the collar is a little bit the same as the last dress, as well as the sleeves. Really see what dressmakers were going for in order to keep that military style in women's clothing. So now we're going to move to children's clothing of the era, which really followed along with what their mothers were wearing. You can see some of that military influence. The dress on the left is, you can see that soutache embroidery that's along the waist, the epaulets at the shoulders, as well as along the wrists, and down by the hem, there's that soutache as well. The dress on the right, very, very similar soutache embroidery and fanciful patterns along the front, as well as kind of mimicking the double buttoned coat of a Union officer's coat jacket. So that was really interesting. Also, a fun fact, both boys and girls wore dresses in their first years of life during the 1860s. So both these items could have been worn by either a boy or a girl. However, as boys at one point would graduate into pants, and once they did, during the 1860s, the sailor suit was a very, very popular option for boys' clothing. This one actually comes from a museum in Australia. It really was a worldwide phenomenon for young boys to wear sailor suits. And these suits pretty much mimicked very closely what sailors in the American and British armies would be wearing at the time. So it's a way for a boy to play soldier, play sailor, and then maybe eventually graduate into that role one day. Okay, from here, we're going to move towards around the turn of the century, where military uniform really starts to swing into the strictly practical. All those fanciful, elaborate costumes of the 19th century really aren't cutting it anymore in terms of modern military technology. So instead, we lean more towards beiges, khaki, drab, things that fit more into the look and feel of the battlefield, help the soldier avoid standing out. These two uniforms are from our collections as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 very practical, efficient military items that have transitioned into civilian fashion and become really staples of our wardrobe. So the first are khakis. Khakis is another thing that comes to us from the British. For the majority of the 19th century, the British were known for those bright red coats. Again, as the smoke-filled battlefield became a thing of the past, that wasn't cutting it anymore. It really became a target of seeing a bright red coat on the battlefield. So they actually took inspiration from their campaigns in India. A lot of the Indian soldiers they worked with would dye their uniforms, stain them with tea, mud, or dirt to help blend in. So the British took up this practice and creating what we now know as khaki. Khaki actually comes from an Urdu and Persian word that means dirt. So Americans picked up on this trend during the Spanish and American War. Both the light colors and the lighter fabric was good for the climate of Cuba. And so it's something we really picked up on wearing. And we started calling khaki pants chinos because chino came from the word China. We thought that the fabric was coming from khakis was coming from China. So we started calling the pants chinos. Now khaki pants are really a staple pant of the traditional modern wardrobe, a really staple work pant, but it's something that did come from our early military campaigns. Our next civilian staple that came from the military was the good old-fashioned t-shirts. They're an everyday clothing item today. I personally, the largest drawer in my dresser is full of t-shirts I collected through college and I've held on to. However, a t-shirt wasn't originally meant to be a fashion item of its own. It was meant to be worn underneath the clothes, something not meant to be seen. So the origins of the t-shirt come from the underclothing that would go underneath the turn of the century wardrobe. So it was either the long john. The long john was those long pant underwear that would come with a long sleeve tee almost. Those are two separate pieces, or the Union suit, which is pictured here in an advertisement from the St. Louis Star and Times, which was just a big onesie almost, those two pieces together. And during the turn of the century, the US Navy gave each sailor that kind of Union suit piece for their underclothing. Sailors, however, got a little restricted by it's less flexible having all that one piece together. So some creative sailors decided they were going to cut the piece at the waist and then chop off the arms, transitioning it essentially into the t-shirt we have today. So by 1913, the US Navy decided, okay, if you can't beat them, join them, and then just gave the t-shirt and then separate pants as their underwear garments. So manufacturers began to pick up on the trend and started manufacturing cotton t-shirts for everyday underwear. It was, however, several decades before we started wearing t-shirts as a piece outside of our clothing, something that could be seen on its own. So this next picture here is a sailor on board. He's actually taking a picture of the ship's cooks. So he's not thinking he's the one in the frame here, but he is, as you can see, wearing t-shirts. And then for our last staple, we're going to talk about the trench coat. This is something that I actually just learned, that trench, it comes from the trenches of World War I. So the trench coat, every element of it was designed to be practical, something that could keep the weather out, keep soldiers from being bogged down by rain, snow, any kind of the elements. So prior to the trench coat, British soldiers in World War I were given long, heavy coats that dragged on the ground, got muddy. If it rained, if it snowed, it would hold the moisture in and weigh down the soldier. It was very, very impractical. However, only the officer got the upgrade. Much like in the 19th century, officers continued to buy their own wardrobe. They would go again to their favorite tailors or to high-class manufacturers like Burberry, who is still a designer today. So every part of the trench coat was designed to be practical, starting with the it was long enough that it covered most of the body, but it wasn't too long that it dragged or made it difficult to walk. It was double-breasted like the officer's coat and still was cinched in at the waist, so it looked just as dashing and as debonair as the officer's coat of days gone by. The belt, the loops in the belt, the little circles, you could hook in all kinds of military equipment, from map holders, binoculars, to things like sabers and guns. You were able to keep things on you very practically. The little cape that's on the back of most trench coats was used to encourage water to fall off the coat rather than soaking in. The little flaps that kind of exist in the elbow area were for ventilation, so that officers didn't overheat during the movement in the trenches. And the cuffs could tighten around the waist with little tighten around the wrist with little straps, so that another way to prevent water from getting in. There also was insert you could put in that was fleece lined for cold environments to help warm up the officer. Finally, the shoulder straps up top could hold the epaulets that would show the officer's rank. So American officers really took to the trench coat once America entered the war, and it became a symbol of the officer in World War I. However, it soon really caught on with the public as well. And that was for two reasons. The first, again, being patriotism, that people wanted to feel some way of feeling connected to their loved ones serving on the front lines. They also wanted in any way possible to feel that connection. So a lot of manufacturers started putting the word trench in front of other standard goods that had nothing to do with life in the trenches, just to boost morale for the war effort. And then finally, too, they were flattering as well as practical. That's why the trench coat has gone on to be really a civilian staple, something that's lasted long beyond World War I, and has remained an item in wardrobes to this day. So I'm going to hand it over to Lydia again. She will jump in with some post-World War I civilian staples as well. Go ahead, Lydia.
Yes, so continuing with our outerwear trend, the pea coat became a fashion staple following the Second World War. This pea coat with an example, and then if we can click through to that one, give it just a minute. The pea coat with an example from soldiers that'll be featured in the middle in just a moment. The pea coat's been around for over 2 centuries with an original variation worn by the Dutch Navy and their piege coats, a term which described the coat's coarse wool fabric. The British reflected this design for their Navy, and the US adopted the coat soon after. It was a durable piece of outerwear that could withstand harsh rain and cold. Its notched collar could be worn up to protect against winds, and it was typified by its 6 to 8 buttons on the front of the double-breasted Navy fabric. Vendors quickly saw the appeal to adapt this design for civilian life, and it remained popular ever since. The style was adapted for children, just like with the sailor suit seen earlier, and it became a staple for the 1960s preppy style, as seen on Jackie Kennedy as well. And let's see if we can get the slide forward in just one moment. Another piece of famous outerwear, and if we can go back one just to show that quick pea coat example. So you have Jackie O, and then the child wearing one on the right as well. And that pea coat in the middle is from our collection here at Soldiers. Moving forward to the Eisenhower jacket, another famous piece of outerwear. The Ike jacket gained popularity during World War II. It received its nickname because it was modeled after the jacket that General Eisenhower had designed, after he deemed his original World War II uniform poor for combat because of its restricted fit. The new version, known as Woolfield Jacket M1944, was waist length with large patch pockets and a pleated back. It featured shoulder straps for attaching rank, as you can see on the left. During the 1950s, the style was adapted into civilian fashion with modifications, as seen in this window display from downtown St. Louis. Its utilitarian style turned into fashionable dress for young college men in the 1950s, and you can see that example posted on the board on the left of that window display. Additionally, Dickies workwear drew inspiration from the Ike silhouette when creating their work jackets, and it became popular everyday work uniforms of the style for the decade following. Moving on, modeled after the one-piece suit worn by boiler workers, the jumpsuit was originally created in 1919 as a functional garment for parachuters. A modification of these designs created the classic style of the American woman during World War II, often referred to as Rosie the Riveter fashion. The collared blouse, buttoned or zipped body with a belt, and the wider or cuffed pant leg were all common aspects of this style. It was made to be easy to move in so that it would not be restrictive for any kind of movement, whether you were jumping out of the plane or building the plane itself. Keeping with this utilitarian nature, going back one, these one-piece outfits were often paired with a headscarf to keep hair away from machinery, as seen in this middle photo, or paired with pinned back hair to keep it out of the way. American designer Vera Maxwell, who was considered famous in the same way that Chanel was at the time, she designed several women's war worker uniforms in the early 1940s. And the coveralls shown here on the right are an example of one of her post-war designs, as the style remained popular in women's sportswear. Eventually, the jumpsuit would morph from workwear to sportswear to evening wear, and its style remains popular today. However, military uniforms were not the only influence on fashion in the 1940s. In 1942, the War Production Board issued what was known as Regulation L85, which rationed natural fibers, limited color choices, and restricted fabric use. Think less full and more short skirts. These changes, paired with the rationing of silk, nylon, wool, leather, and rubber, drastically influenced fashion. You can see this in the use it up, wear it out, make it do poster on the left, featuring a woman mending a man's clothes. Additionally, with fabric restrictions, more patterned fabrics became popular, especially with patriotic red, white, and blue influences. This dress features the narrow waist and shorter length required at the time, but the pattern features a patriotic row of soldiers across. And I think that detailing, it looks very nice. One of the many items rationed during the war was silk, which led to some unique fashion influences. Because Japan had been the sole supplier of silk to the US, the fall in trade relations in 1941 cut off supply. The Office of Production Management in the US seized the nation's supply of raw silk and for parachutes and naval gunpowder bags. Women were asked to donate their silk stockings to the war effort, and it became popular for women to begin shaving their legs and painting a line down the back of their legs to mimic the seam found in stockings. However, following the war, the silk shortage remained, and a number of women made their wedding dresses out of the silk parachutes utilized by their fiancés during the war, as seen in this example from the Smithsonian. This was both materially savvy, but also served as a way to honor their partner's service. Moving beyond World War II, during the Vietnam War, POW and MIA bracelets became a common accessory across the United States. Started by a group of college students wanting to support US troops in Vietnam without being involved in the controversy of protests and demonstrations, metal bracelets were produced with the name, rank, and date of loss engraved on the band. Traditionally, the bracelet would be worn until the POW returned home, and the bracelet would then be presented to the former prisoner. Between 1970 and 1976, approximately 5 million of these bracelets were sold, and the ones on the screen are from the collection of the Smithsonian. However, for those participating in those protests and demonstrations against the war, many utilized military surplus stores to don khakis and green jackets as part of their anti-establishment agenda. Their use of military clothing was a visual tactic to create cohesion between the protesters, but also as a symbolic form of rebellion against the traditions, standards, and rules of the military. Here on the left, you can see an image of a soldier wearing the green field jacket in Vietnam. And then on the left, you have the styles worn by Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver or by Linda Cardinelli in Freaks and Geeks, mimicking that style perpetuated through the grunge and punk scene of the 1980s and 1990s. This similar concept of utilizing military fashion can be seen here in the fashion of rock and pop stars at the time. Mick Jagger and Jimi Hendrix, pictured on the left, both sported military-influenced jackets during performances, while the Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band showed the band wearing neon versions of this style. It's been seen before in the women's dresses of the 1800s, as Lindsay presented earlier, and its reoccurrence was partly thanks to the Army and Navy surplus clothing stores and secondhand stores becoming popular in the late 60s. But moving forward, beginning with the 1980s, you start seeing this appearance of bomber jackets from Indiana Jones and Top Gun, making the jacket style popular, even though it had been originally developed all the way in World War I and World War II. This same occurrence happened with cargo pants. They'd been originally designed to update the Army jumpsuit in the 1940s, but they were discontinued in the 1960s when adapted for jungle fatigues in Vietnam. The unpopularity of the Vietnam War and resentment many felt towards those returning veterans limited their widespread acceptance until 20 years later, with early waves of 80s and 90s streetwear, cargo pants becoming popular with outdoorsy types and suburban parents alike. However, more recently, military-inspired fashions can be seen today through safari-inspired clothes or the rise and fall of camouflage and the annual necessity of winter and fall coats. Some more recent extreme examples can be found in the world of high fashion, such as with Jeremy Scott for Adidas in 2013, pictured here on the left, or the Chanel 2009 Cruise metallic gun shoe. So, from early epaulettes and zouave fashion highlighted by Lindsay, to the children's wear seen throughout, and the creation of military-inspired streetwear, from the latter half of the last century, the military has always had an influence on fashion, whether it be directly through uniforms or the circumstances created by war. Thank you all so much for joining us today in our presentation, and we look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you again. Thank you, Lydia, for that half of the presentation. I don't think right now we have anyone in the Q&A, but I'll give a few seconds for anyone who has any questions pop up. I can put in the chat both Lydia and my email address in case anyone has any questions later on. Well, while we're waiting, Lydia, I know you told me earlier about spray-on nylons. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it was common during World War II that because you had to donate your silk or nylon stocking, that it would be required of you to donate them as your patriotic duty. But to maintain that similar look or appearance that was popular, women began shaving their legs, and they would use products called liquid nylon, which is essentially airbrush foundation of the 40s, to paint their legs. And then they would use a thin, almost eyeliner-like pencil to draw a seam up the back of their legs to mimic that stitching that would have been found in the stockings originally. And over time, that developed into women no longer wearing stockings and continuing to shave their legs today.
I think that's incredibly fascinating. I know we've talked to, Lydia and I work right next to each other. We chatted about, when we're doing research about how like leg foundation still is a thing that exists today, that some women.
Yes, you can still find it in stores today. Find airbrush foundation for your leg.
Yeah, for sure. We just got an anonymous attendee said, very interesting, thank you. Interesting to wonder how the rise of Army/Navy surplus stores have played a role in spreading military clothing among civilians, and how marketers use the term military grade to boost sales. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, especially with items that like something like parkas, things that say, oh, the military uses this and this goes to negative 20 degrees, you'll be comfortable and warm, those kind of things. I think that's super interesting as well.
Speaking towards the first half of that question, the rise of Army and Navy surplus stores and antique and vintage stores originally started in popularity over in England. You would have performers going there to find different fun and exciting costumes. And with the rise of so many military items being donated, they found them to be extravagant and exciting options to wear, which then became reflected in more mass-produced civilian fashion as well.
All right, that looks like that's our only question we've got in, which is totally fine. So I'll go ahead and bring us into our last slide. Just thank you again for everyone for tuning in. It was great to have you with us today, even virtual. This originally was an in-person program, but due to Omicron and COVID concerns, we switched it to virtual. This program, again, will be available on YouTube here shortly. So if you'd like to send it to a friend, friend of a friend, a family member, anyone you'd like, feel free to do so. It'll be up on YouTube soon. And we'd also like to invite you to join us Wednesday, February 9th at noon for our Chow and Chat series. Behedin Pirik is going to present on his family's experiences during the Bosnian War. He grew up in the very early years of the war, and his family was able to escape as a refugee to the United States. So it'll be a really interesting story, and I'm very excited to hearing that from him. So hopefully you can join us. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you at Soldiers Memorial sometime soon.